Hi, Professor Kukral here again, and I want to talk to you about, well, let me stop here a second. I want to talk to you about state formation in Europe, how countries are created, and about state boundaries. I think I have a couple friends that decide to join us here today. But, what is a state? A state is a country. When we talk about states in the U.S., they're civil divisions of the United States. When we're talking about international boundaries and countries, we're really talking about states formally and how states are formed. That's a big issue to a lot of people. Modern day states, the states we have now, are really creations that aren't more than usually a couple hundred years old, if that old. Europe looked very, very different. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, we can go back 110 years, and it's going to be a very different map of Europe. If we go back to the 1600s, it's going to be quite different as well. And if we go back 1,000 years, hardly anything would be recognizable on the map of Europe as far as states. Now, people, ethnic groups, national groups, they've always been there. You've always had the English, you've always had the Polish, you've always had the Italians. To some extent, okay, the idea of national identities, though, has really grown in the 1800s, and that led to the formation of what we see today as ethno-linguistic boundaries, mostly making up Europe. Okay, what is a state, though? Think about this for a while. What is a state? Well, a state is a piece of territory, piece of land. First of all, it has borders. Okay, it has some form of government. It has some form of military, in most cases, not all, military or policing to keep the laws that are created by the government there. Okay, it has some monetary system in most cases. Okay, a state doesn't necessarily have a distinctive religion or a distinctive language or a distinctive culture so much, but it does have a population, as I said. And the last thing, one of the most important things a state must have, is recognition by other states that they exist as such. Okay, if I declare this room a state, I'll say, yes, let's make this room a state, or let's make the classroom a state. These are the boundaries. You guys are the population. We'll have a flag. We don't need a flag, but we'll have a flag anyways. We'll make some money that we'll use, and you guys over here will be in charge of enforcing the laws of the government here, basically, and protecting the population. Okay? So we have a state. We declare independence from everybody else. And what is that exactly? Well, it's a semblance of a state, but it's not really a country until you get recognition. You need recognition by major world powers. That's just how things are. Unless the rest of the world decides to recognize you as a state, you don't exist as one. And there's a lot of those places around the earth right now. Not a lot, but there's several places that have declared independence, that claim, we have our own government, we have our own boundaries we've decided on, but the rest of the world doesn't recognize that. Okay, and that's also true from some bigger places too. When we look at a map, we as Americans, when we look at a U.S. map of the world, these are the countries that the United States recognizes to exist. Okay, we give them diplomatic recognition as sovereign states, as independent states. Okay, you look at a map made in China of the world, it might have a few different places. If you look at a map made in Saudi Arabia, it may have some different places. If you look at a map made in Libya, it might be different as well. Okay, so we have a state. It's recognized by other countries. It has boundaries of some type. What do we have in the U.S. for boundaries? Mostly geometric boundaries between us and Canada. Okay, that's not ethno-linguistic. All right, not like in Europe, but it's a geometric boundary. What do you have in Africa? Mostly colonial boundaries. that are not ethno-linguistic. They're colonial boundaries, often geometric, often without any rhyme or reason as to the people there. So, you know, when Europe has ethno-linguistic boundaries, that's something very, very distinctive you won't find anywhere else. Those boundaries are the state boundaries for the most part. Okay, so we don't have to go through the Middle Ages or all this other stuff. If we go back to then, you wouldn't recognize a map of Europe. Everyone should look at a map of Europe from 1,000 years ago and see what it looks like. You know, you'll find the Carolingian Empire, you'll find the Byzantine Empire, you'll find England. You won't recognize too much else on the map of Europe 1,000 years ago. Okay, you'll see Spain. Spain was part of the Islamic world then, and it's distinctive on the map. That's a very old boundary between Spain and France. Okay, the rest of Europe on the continent, though, changed all the time, shifted. We go back 500 years. You're going to see lots and lots of countries all over the map of Europe. You're going to see what is today the German land, Central Europe, all fragmented into what? Principalities, dukedoms, baronies, all kinds of different divisions with different rulers, principalities. You're not going to see anything that looks like a unified Germany. You're going to find very few people who would call themselves Germans at that time. Okay, they're going to call themselves Bavarians, or they're going to call themselves Saxons, or they're going to call themselves Silesians, or they're going to call themselves Prussians. Even into the 19th century, this is what Germany was like. And if you look at, anytime you do maybe some genealogical work or historical work or work in archives, and you look at immigration records to the U.S., it will list people as coming from places like Prussia, Saxony, Silesia, Bavaria. It won't say they're from Germany for the most part, because Germany didn't exist until 1871. You know, Bismarck put Germany together. And after a couple wars with the other German people, who were the other big German people, the Austrians, they had a big empire, and probably a pretty powerful one. The Habsburg family out of Vienna. Okay, you had the Habsburgs out of Vienna. You had the Hohenzollern family out of Berlin. These were the two rival German powers in the 19th century, and they wanted to create a unified German state. You also had a third group, the Wittelsbach family out of Bavaria, but they weren't as militarily as powerful, you could say, not nearly. And there were several others, but the big two, Berlin and Vienna. Okay, why did they want to unify the German people and create a unified Germany? Why was that important in 1866, 67, 70, 71? These were the years of fighting, Austro-Prussian wars, other things that went on. Well, a big part of it was they were losing the race. What race were they losing? They were losing the colonial race. When you look at the countries to the west of Germany, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the British, even the Spanish and Portuguese, if you look at these countries, they had massive colonial empires all over the world. They had goods coming in to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Okay, that's what colonialism was about, really, to make the home country powerful. They weren't trying to make the colonial states powerful. That's why some fought wars against them, like the United States, become independent. Okay, but the German people needed to unify so they could also claim colonies and territories and land rather than fighting against each other as they'd been doing for about 800 years. Okay, so who was going to unify the Germans? The Habsburgs in Vienna, Austria, or the Hohenzollern up in Berlin in Prussia? Well, after a war and after some agreements, the German Empire was created. Okay, the Kingdom of Germany, 1871, with a king or a Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm I, and a Chancellor Bismarck. So Germany was on the map, and Austria became a republic later. Austria was still down there. Okay, Austria were the southern Germans. Okay, and they expanded their empire with Hungary then and created Austria-Hungary in 1867. Okay, sort of the Hungarian Compromise. But anyways, the big difference was the Habsburg family in Austria, the Germans, were Catholic, and the Hohenzollerns were Protestant in Berlin. And that sort of helped shape the future of the German people, too, as well. The ones in Germany, the ones in Austria, how that would work out for them. Two rival powers. The French, of course, overthrew the monarchy, and the monarchies had been ruling Europe for about at least 1,000 years, and it was one extended family. You have to remember they were all related. The royals of Europe, they were all related by the 19th century. You know, even today, look at the British royal family. Are they all British? Is that their history? No, not at all. Not at all. Prince Philip, who's the grandfather of Prince William, right? Prince Philip, husband of Queen Elizabeth, his father was the king of Greece. And his grandmother was the sister of the Tsar of Russia. And many of his family members were Germans. Okay, German aristocracy, the Mountbatten family. The Battenbergs, they called themselves in Germany, Battenberg. And when they got in links with the British royal family, then they changed it to Mountbatten. But anyway, so his family background's all diverse, just like all the other royals of Europe. They were all mixed. And they ran this continent for a long time, and they created empires that were not made up of one group of people, but they were multi-ethnic empires. They had lots of different peoples in their empires. Some were global empires. The British global empire, you know, it included India. It included half of Africa. It was places like Hong Kong. It was a huge global empire that the British had. Okay, the French had a huge empire all over the world too. Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, much of Africa were part of the French colonial world. The French overthrew the monarchy after seeing what we could do to them, right? The French Revolution, 1789 to 92, really the first country to do that. It made some of the other royal families hold on a little tighter after that happened. Okay, so when we look at Europe, though, in the 19th century, still had these royal families in charge in most parts, except France, from the Tsar of Russia to the Queen of England. You had powerful leaders. Okay, you had royal families in Scandinavia, in Italy, in Spain, in the German lands. Austria-Hungary probably had the most powerful leaders in the Habsburg family. The Austrian Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was highly multi-ethnic. It included the German-speaking Austrians. It included Hungarians. It included all of the Czech people and the Slovak people. It included all of the Croatians and Slovenians. It included some of the Bosnians and Serbs, but not many until it was annexed. That wasn't a good idea, was it, to annex Bosnia by the Austrian Empire? When the heir to the throne went there in 1914, what did they do? Everybody knows this. They shot him. They killed him. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay, 1914, that started the First World War. And the First World War, what are some of the results of the First World War in Europe? Well, one of the main things that ended the power of the monarchy all over Europe. Okay? Either they were gotten rid of completely, okay, like they were forced to abdicate and leave the country, like the Habsburgs in Austria, they were forced out. The Crown Prince was just a couple years old, a few years old, and he only died about 10 years ago. He was 98 years old, but he was not allowed to ever set foot in Austria until the 1990s. They allowed him to come back and visit as a citizen, things like that. Okay, the Germans, after World War I, the German Kaiser had to abdicate, Wilhelm II. He had to flee Germany. He lived out the rest of his life in the Netherlands. Even during the days of World War II and Hitler, he was living in the Netherlands, the former German Kaiser. What happened to the Tsar of Russia? Well, he was assassinated. Okay, him and his whole family, Nicholas II. They were all shot to death during the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Okay? All of the royal families of Europe lost any power they really had at the end of World War I in 1918. Okay? So that really changed Europe. And with that, the breakdown of their empires. We can look at what happened in the Austrian Empire as an example. I just said it was a multi-ethnic empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, if you like. When World War I ended and they lost, they were on the side with the Turks and the Germans. Okay, when they lost, the idea was a lot of these people within this empire wanted independence, and they got it. You know, the President Wilson's 14 points pushed for that. The Paris Peace Treaty at the end of World War I, or the Treaty of Versailles, pushed for that. And so you had new countries on the map of Europe after 1918. You had Czechoslovakia, a country made up of the Czech people and the Slovak people, put together out of the old Austrian Empire. You had a Republic of Hungary. You had a Republic of Austria. Okay, no longer a royal family there, but great things to visit if you go to Vienna, right? You can see the monumental history of this family there and their architecture that they created. You had a new country because they were just seemed like too many ethnic groups to deal with, so they created Yugoslavia in the south. And Yugoslavia had what? It had the Serbs and Slovenes and Croats and Bosnians and Macedonians and Montenegrins, and then a whole bunch of other minorities. Well, that held together for about 70 years. And then those ethnic tensions started to become stronger, and peoples like the Slovenes declared an independent Slovenia in 1991. By 93, there was conflict and fighting, and we had war in the Balkan state down there in the breakup, the end of Yugoslavia. That's what happened down there. You had some countries on the map like Romania that acquired a lot of territory, new territory. Poland was on the map again for the first time since the 1790s. What happened to Poland in Poland's history is pretty interesting. It was divided up by the three powers around them by the 1790s. Why? Well, the Germans took part, the Austrians took part, and the Russians took part of Poland. They did that because they feared what happened in France. The French Revolution overthrew and executed all the aristocracy they could, including the royals. Everybody knows that about the guillotine and stuff. Well, those feelings were pretty strong too in this part of Europe about democracy, and they saw the country, the area that had the greatest strength was Poland. And so they dismantled it by taking land away and conquering it. The Germans, the Russians, and the Austrians divided it all up, so there was no more Poland until 1918. There were always Polish people. You got to remember that. You got to think that, you know, when we talk about, well, the country was gone. Well, the people weren't gone. You know, there were always the people living there that were Polish. Now, if we look at the British Isles, that's a little different story. They were separated by water. The last big invasion of the British Isles was probably have to go back to 1066, the Norman invasion, things like that. It's not like they had armies marching across them, okay, like on continental Europe and people like Napoleon, okay. The Napoleonic Wars were pretty devastating to much of Europe. Anyway, state formation's different everywhere. You can read about it in the chapter. They're going to talk about the creation of Italy in the 19th century, the creation of Germany in 1871. They're going to talk about the unification of the United Kingdom in the British Isles. We're going to see how countries are created. And I think that's pretty interesting stuff. Because, why? Because we assume that's how it's always been. And the answer is, it's never been that way. The countries of Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, there are still people living who were born, not too many anymore, but who were born under these monarchies and these empires that existed before World War I. Okay, that's 100 years ago now. That's why I said there's not too many left. But when I was young, a lot of the old folks who were immigrants around the turn of the century, they came from places like Austria-Hungary. Okay, they came from a different world of monarchs and empires and Russian czars and German kaisers, imperial armies, you know, things like that. And by the mid 20th century, after World War II, they moved people around, they moved borders around, and sort of placed everything in ethnographic or ethno-linguistic boundaries. I hope everybody's really confused by now. I've thrown out a lot of history with geography, and I think the answer, like the answer to most things in life, look at a map. Okay, you really need to look at a good map. Look at some old maps. Okay, look at some maps of Europe from 1900. You'll only see about 4 big countries on the continent. That's it. Okay, we have a lot more countries now. You'll see in 1900 the Russian Empire, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. You'll see these big places. That was everything just about. Okay, look at a map from 500 years ago of Europe, and look at all the confusion of the smaller countries, the smaller states that were all over the place. A few of those were able to remain. People ask me, why is there Liechtenstein? Why is there Luxembourg? Why is there Monaco? Why is there Andorra? Well, it goes back to a time when these countries were typical in size of other places, but for one reason or another, often because of treaties, they were able somehow to maintain their independence, or they were in an isolated mountain area and nobody cared about them. That's pretty much true. Or other larger countries just wanted their influence out of their government, like the Vatican. And so Mussolini helped the Vatican become independent from Italy because he didn't want the Pope's interference in the politics of Italy. Things like that went on as well. And look at a map of 1,000 years ago. There's tons of historical maps on the internet of Europe. So look at some. Look at Europe of 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, and just 100 years ago. And if your family or your ancestors came from Europe, keep in mind that the boundaries have changed again and again. Who they were might have not changed as far as their ethnicity and culture. That was always there. The other thing I'll add to that, though, is that people migrated all over the place, all over Europe. They went for jobs, they went to work in other countries all the time. You know, if you think your family's from Italy, well, doing some research, you might find out some of them came from Greece 100 years before and they migrated to Italy for a job. Or you think your family's always been Germans, well, you might find out some of them came from Poland a couple hundred years ago. And they went to the German lands because there were better opportunities for work there. The same with the British Isles. People migrated, people moved around all over Europe for century and century. I do some work with a genealogy group, with mapping, with helping them understand historical maps. And one thing I think is funny, a lot of people, they get DNA tests done and it shows answers that they don't like to see. They just want to see what they think they know in DNA. But the truth is, people have moved all over the place in the past. People have always migrated. People have always been a vast diversity of cultures. And if we look at Europe specifically, we'll see that only in the second half of the 20th century, after World War II, do we really have these national identities that are fairly strong. Okay? So that's enough for now. Like I said, I hope I didn't confuse you too much. But this is the typical lecture I would give introducing the states of Europe. And please do the chapter reading to clarify all the things I said, and let me know how everything else is going too. Okay? So that's it. I think the cats have left finally. They like it when I come in this room for some reason. See you later. Bye.